Imagine a wind so cold it feels like it's trying to carve the skin right off your bones. That's the kind of wind that rolls down the peaks into Dry Creek. It's a warning. It tells you to keep moving, to keep your head down, to mind your own business. But on this particular winter day, the wind wasn't the cruelest thing in town. Not by a long shot. The real cruelty was happening right in the center of the frozen street, where a crowd of decent church-going folks stood around watching a child get destroyed. They were shaving a 6-year-old girl's head. They said it was justice. They said it was to wash away the sins of her father. But if you looked closely at their faces, you didn't see justice. You saw fear. You saw a mob that needed someone to blame for their own misfortunes, and they picked the smallest target they could find. But here's the thing about bullets: they always assume no one is watching, or at least no one dangerous enough to do anything about it. They didn't see the rider coming down the mountain pass. They didn't see the worn leather of his coat, or the way his gun belt hung low and heavy on his hip. They didn't know that the man riding into their town was the kind of man who had forgotten how to be afraid a long time ago. Today, we are diving into a story of cold retribution, hidden truths, and the kind of silence that happens right before the gun smoke clears. Before we saddle up, if you enjoy stories where the underdog bites back and justice is served ice cold, do me a favor, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. It helps us bring these lost legends back to life. Now, let's head into Dry Creek. The first thing Caleb Mercer noticed wasn't the people, it was the silence. He'd spent enough years drifting through the frontier territories to know the rhythm of a town in winter. Usually, you'd hear the clatter of a wagon wheel, the dull thud of an axe splitting firewood, or the low hum of conversation spilling out of a saloon. But Dry Creek was dead quiet. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a gunshot or precedes a hanging. Caleb's horse, a roan mare with as many miles on her as he had on his soul, huffed a cloud of steam into the frigid air. The snow was packed hard on the main road, crunching like broken glass under the hooves. Caleb kept his head low, the brim of his weathered hat pulled down just enough to shadow his eyes. He wasn't hiding, exactly. He just preferred not to be seen until he was ready. He tied the mare to a hitching post outside the general store, his movements slow and deliberate. He checked the cinch, patted the horse's neck, and then did he turn his attention to the street. Half the town was gathered in a circle about 50 yards away. Men in heavy wool coats, women with shawls pulled tight against the biting wind. They weren't moving. They were watching something in the center of that circle. And whatever it was, it had sucked the air right out of the town. Caleb walked toward them. He didn't hurry. A man in a hurry draws attention, and Caleb Mercer had spent the last 3 years trying to be invisible. He was a man with a price on his head that could buy a decent ranch in 3 different states. But curiosity is a dangerous itch, and something about the posture of the crowd's stiff backs, the crossed arms, told him this wasn't a town meeting. Then he heard it. It wasn't a scream. It was a sob. The kind of broken, hiccuping cry that comes from a chest that's too small to hold that much grief. Caleb pushed through the outer edge of the crowd. He didn't shove, he just moved with the kind of density that makes people step aside without knowing why. He found a gap between 2 farmers and looked into the center of the ring. A wooden chair sat in the snow. In the chair was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She was shivering, partly from the cold. Her dress was thin, threadbare cotton, completely useless against the mountain chill, but mostly from terror. Standing behind her was a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of granite, Mrs. Hargrove. She held a pair of iron shears in her hand. The blades were cold and dull. A lock of blonde hair fell onto the dirty snow. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out and freezing on her cheeks. She looked like a plucked bird. One side of her head was already shorn close to the scalp, leaving pale, vulnerable skin exposed to the winter wind. "Please," the girl whispered. It was so quiet Caleb barely caught it over the wind. "I want my papa." Mrs. Hargrove grabbed the girl's chin, her fingers digging into the soft flesh, forcing the child's head straight. "Your papa is gone, child," the woman said. her voice loud enough for the back row to hear, and he ain't coming back. He brought shame on this town. Yow'll carry the mark of it so you don't grow up to be a thief like him. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. That's right, a man near Caleb muttered. Bad blood in that family. Best to cut it out early. Caleb looked at the man. The farmer didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying the show. Caleb felt a familiar sensation in his gut. It was a tightening like a coiled spring. He'd felt it in saloons before a brawl. He'd felt it in canyons before an ambush. It was the feeling of violence waking up. He looked back at the girl. The shears opened again. The metallic rasp was sickeningly loud. Hold still, Mrs. Hargrove snapped. Unless you want me to take an ear with it. The girl sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking. I didn't steal anything. Papa didn't steal anything. Silence. Hargrove struck the back of the chair with her free hand. The sound cracked like a whip. That was it. That was the moment the scale tipped. Caleb Mercer stepped out from the crowd. The sound of his boots on the hard-packed snow was heavy, deliberate. Asterisk crunch. Crunch. Asterisk a few heads turned. They saw a tall man, broad in the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen more rain and dust than most of them would see in a lifetime. They saw a gun belt that wasn't just for showed leather was worn smooth around the holster, the sign of a weapon that was drawn often. Mrs. Hargrove looked up, her eyes narrowing. She paused with the shears mid-air. And who are you? She demanded. Her voice was sharp, used to being obeyed. Caleb didn't answer her. He didn't even look at her. He walked straight up to the wooden chair. He crouched down, ignoring the wet snow soaking into his jeans, bringing himself to eye level with the child. The girl flinched, expecting another blow. When nothing happened, she slowly opened her eyes. They were wide, blue, and terrified. Caleb reached out. His hand was gloved, large and rough. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from her tear-stained face. "Hey there," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "What's your name?" The girl sniffled, confused. "Emily." "Emily," Caleb repeated. "That's a good name. My name's Caleb." "Zeet, Mrs." Hargrove took a step forward. The shears pointed like a weapon. "This is town business. You have no right to interfere. Step away from the girl." Caleb slowly stood up. He turned. He didn't move fast, but the air around him seemed to change pressure. When he looked at Mrs. Hargrove, his eyes were flat and unreadable. "I think you've done enough barbering for one day," Caleb said. The crowd shifted uneasily. The menace radiating off this stranger was palpable. "This girl is the daughter of a thief," Mrs. Hargrove spat, though she took a half-step back. Her father stole from the town supply wagons. He was hanged for it not 3 weeks ago. The town decided she needs to learn a lesson about shame. Shame, Caleb repeated the word, tasting it. He looked around the circle of faces. Is that what this is? Shame? He looked at the men standing with their hands in their pockets. He looked at the mothers clutching their own children, watching a 6-year-old freeze in the snow. "Seems to me," Caleb said, his voice rising just enough to cut through the wind, "that you folks have plenty of shame already. You just don't know where to put it." "You watch your tongue, stranger," a man shouted from the crowd. "You don't know the law here." Caleb unbuttoned his heavy coat. He shrugged it off his shoulders. The cold hit him, but he didn't react. He turned back to Emily and draped the heavy wool around her. It engulfed her small frame, smelling of tobacco, horse, and warmth. "There," Caleb said softly to her. "Better?" Emily nodded, clutching the lapels with tiny freezing fists. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome." Caleb turned back to the crowd. He was just in his vest and shirt now, and the gun on his hip was fully visible. It was a peacemaker, the handle bone white. "You shaved the wrong man's child," Caleb announced. Mrs. Hargrove scoffed. "And how would a drifter know anything about Thomas Carter?" "Because," Caleb said, "I knew him." That stopped them. The murmurs died down. "I met Thomas Carter 3 weeks ago," Caleb continued, scanning the crowd. "On the trail about 2 days' ride north of here. We shared a fire. He shared his coffee, and he told me a story. Liars keep company with liars, Mrs. Hargrove sneered. He told me, Caleb went on, ignoring her, that he found out who was really stealing from your wagons. He told me he was coming back to Dry Creek to confront the man. He said the thief wasn't an outlaw. He said the thief was a man this town trusted. As Caleb spoke, he watched the faces. He was looking for a reaction, a twitch, a bead of sweat. And then Caleb said, 2 days later he's dead, hanged by the very people he was trying to protect. "Sheriff," Mrs. Hargrove yelled, "are you going to let this outlaw slander our town?" At the back of the crowd parted. Sheriff Amos Pike pushed his way through. He was an older man, tired-looking, with a star pinned to a coat that was missing a button. But flanking him was his deputy, Frank Miller, a younger man with shifty eyes and a hand that hovered too close to his gun. And behind them, that's when things got complicated. 2 riders had just entered the far end of the street. They wore long dusters. They rode with the easy arrogance of men who hunt people for money. Bounty hunters. Caleb saw them. He knew them instantly. Luke Danner and his partner. They had been tracking him for months. Caleb's heart didn't speed up. It slowed down. This was the precipice. If he walked away now, he could slip out the back alleys before Danner saw him. He could survive. But he looked down at Emily, wrapped in his coat, looking up at him like he was the only solid thing in a world that was melting away. He stayed put. "What's the trouble here?" Sheriff Pike asked, looking between Mrs. Hargrove and Caleb. "This man is interfering with the punishment," Hargrove said, "and he's making accusations." Pike looked at Caleb. His eyes narrowed. He recognized the face. "You don't wear a badge for 20 years without memorizing the wanted posters." "Mercer," the sheriff breathed. "Caleb Mercer." The name went through the crowd like an electric shock. Blackjack Mercer. The bank robber. The gunfighter. The man worth $5,000, dead or alive. "That's him," someone shouted. Fear rippled through the bystanders. They scrambled back, widening the circle. At the end of the street, Luke Danner heard the name. He stopped his horse. He smiled. He dismounted, pulling a Winchester rifle from his saddle scabbard. Well, Danner's voice carried down the street. "Looks like today is my lucky day." Caleb didn't turn to face the bounty hunter. He kept his eyes on the sheriff and the deputy. "Sheriff," Caleb said calmly, "you hanged an innocent man. Thomas Carter was a thief," Deputy Miller spoke up. His voice was loud, too loud. "We found the money in his barn." "Did you?" Caleb asked. He took a step toward the deputy. "Or did you put it there?" Miller's face flushed red. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you a thief and a murderer," Caleb said. The silence was absolute. "Thomas told me the thief had a badge," Caleb said. "He told me he saw the deputy taking a cut from the supply shipments. He was going to turn you in, Miller. But you got to him first, planted the money, riled up the town, and got them to do your dirty work before he could speak." "That's Ali," Miller shouted. He looked at the sheriff. "Amos, shoot him. He's a wanted killer." Sheriff Pike hesitated. He looked at his deputy. He looked at the sweat forming on Miller's brow despite the freezing cold. He looked at the way Miller's eyes were darting around, looking for an exit. "Frank?" the sheriff asked softly. "Why are you sweating?" "He's an outlaw, Amos. Shoot him." "I'm listening to him," Pike said slowly. "Enough," Miller screamed. Desperation is a dangerous thing. It makes men stupid. Deputy Miller didn't draw on Caleb. He knew Caleb was too fast. Instead, Miller panicked. He grabbed the closest leverage he could find. He snatched his gun out of his holster and aimed it at Emily. "Back off," Miller shrieked. "Everyone back off or the girl gets it." The crowd gasped. Mrs. Hargrove screamed. Emily froze, her eyes locked on the black barrel of the revolver pointed at her face. Caleb Mercer didn't scream. He didn't gasp. He just moved. It happened in the space between heartbeats. Deputy Miller's finger tightened on the trigger. The sound was deafening in the narrow street, but Emily didn't fall. Deputy Miller screamed, dropping his gun. He fell to his knees, clutching a hand that was suddenly a ruin of blood and shattered bone. Smoke curled from the end of Caleb's peacemaker. He hadn't aimed for the kill. He had aimed to disarm. At 40 feet, with a snapshot, he had blown the gun right out of the deputy's hand. Caleb thumbed the hammer back, aiming the gun squarely at Miller's chest. "Don't," Caleb said. Miller was sobbing in the snow, curling in on himself. Sheriff Pike stared at his deputy, then at the smoking gun on the ground. The realization washed over him. The betrayal, the guilt. Pike walked over to Miller, kicked the gun away, and hauled his deputy up by the collar. "You framed him? You let us hang Thomas?" "I had to," Miller blubbered. He was going to ruin everything. The crowd was stunned. The anger they had directed at the little girl suddenly had nowhere to go. It rebounded on them. They looked at Emily shivering in the outlaw's coat. They realized what they had done. They had tortured a child to cover the tracks of a monster. But the story wasn't over. Impressive shot. The voice came from behind Caleb. Caleb turned slowly. Luke Danner was standing 20 feet away, the Winchester leveled at Caleb's chest. His partner was flanking him with a shotgun. "Caleb Mercer," Danner said. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for this." The town held its breath. The sheriff was busy cuffing his deputy. The civilians were paralyzed. It was just the outlaw and the hunter. Emily looked up at Caleb. "Are they bad men?" she asked, tugging on the giant coat. Caleb looked down at her. "No, just men doing a job. You helped me," she said. "Yeah. Are you going to die?" Caleb looked back at Danner. The rifle was steady. Danner didn't miss. "Danner," Caleb said. "You got me. I ain't going to fight you in the middle of a street with a kid standing here." Danner nodded. "Smart." But Caleb continued, "I got a request. You're in no position to bargain, Mercer. This girl," Caleb pointed to Emily, "she's got no one. Her dad was innocent. The town just found out. They owe her. But I want to make sure she gets settled before I go with you." Danner looked at Emily. He saw the shaved head. He saw the tears. He saw the way she was looking at Caleb Mercer like he was Superman. Danner looked at the deputy bleeding in the snow. He looked at the sheriff, who was looking at the ground in shame. Danner lowered the rifle. "Just an inch." "What happened to her hair?" Danner asked. "Town folks got confused about who the real criminal was," Caleb said. "I stepped in." Danner chewed on the inside of his cheek. He was a hard man. He hunted men for money. But every man has a code. "You cleared a dead man's name?" Danner asked. "I did. And you saved the kid." "Someone had to." Danner stood there for a long moment. The wind howled again, blowing snow between them. Finally, Danner sighed. He levered the round out of the chamber of his Winchester and slid the rifle back into his saddle scabbard. "My horse threw a shoe 5 miles back," Danner announced loudly, addressing the air. "Damn thing needs fixing. Gonna take me at least an hour to get the smith to look at it." His partner looked at him confused. "Luke, the horse is fine." Danner shot his partner a glare that could cut glass. "The horse. Through." The partner blinked, then slowly holstered his shotgun. "Right. Yeah, through a shoe." Danner looked at Caleb. If a man were to ride hard toward the high pass, he might get ahead of the storm. But he'd have to leave now. Caleb nodded. A silent understanding passed between them. A debt paid for a deed done. "Obliged," Caleb said. Caleb turned to Emily. He knelt down one last time. "I have to go, Emily. Can I keep the coat?" she asked. Caleb smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in a long time. "You keep the coat. You grow into it. Will you come back?" "If the wind blows right," he said. He stood up. He walked to his horse, untied the reins, and mounted up. The town watched him. Mrs. Hargrove watched him, her face pale with a shame that would last a lifetime. Sheriff Pike watched him with gratitude. Caleb Mercer didn't look back. He spurred the mare and rode out toward the mountains, disappearing into the white haze of the storm. Dry Creek was never the same after that. They say the sheriff raised Emily like his own. They say the town built a statue for Thomas Carter. but mostly they tell the story of the winter day when the worst man in the territory turned out to be the only decent soul in town. It's strange how history judges us, isn't it? Sometimes the badge hides the criminal, and the wanted poster hides the hero. If this story gave you chills, or if you just appreciate a moment when the bad guys get exactly what's coming to them, do me a solid, hit that subscribe button. We release stories like this every week, digging into the gritty, untold side of the frontier. What do you think? Would you have stopped for the girl, knowing the hunters were right behind you? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, keep your powder dry.